Hey guys, so today we're talking about the civil rights movement. We're going to talk about the origins of the civil rights movement and how it got to where it was, and the basic beginning foundations of it before you look at it more within class. So, the civil rights movement is going to be founded in this idea of rights liberalism. And this means the idea that an individual requires the government protection from discrimination. This is a version of liberalism that is promoted by the civil rights movement and in other social justice movements later that are inspired by the civil rights movement. Things like the Chicano movement, the Red Power movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, things like that. And they're going to focus on the identities of race, gender, things like that, rather than the general social welfare that have been promoted in New Deal liberalism. And they're going to be focusing on the idea that the government can provide protection under the law and legislation in order to protect people's rights and equalities and their place in the system. That whole idea. So when we're talking about the foundation of the civil rights movement, we have to talk about Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws are going to be put in place under Plessy versus Ferguson, which is going to establish separate but equal, right? And that's been established for a very long time at this point in history. And it is literally all over the United States. The place where it is the most relaxed are the West Coast states like Washington, Oregon, and California, but it's in the North and it's in the South. I know I always have thought when I was in high school, like, oh yeah, like the North, like things were so much better here. We weren't racist, but we were, okay? The segregation was all over the United States. Some southern states, such as South Carolina and Mississippi, have populations of 30 to 50% African American, and that's going to be about 15 million in 1950. In 1950, about 10% of the U.S. population is African American. The southern states are deeply divided. The segregation is even worse, and their legalized segregation. And you're going to see that African Americans have no chance of working for a state or city government. Their employment is limited to cleaning, cooking, working in warehouses, loading, sharecropping, and that kind of stuff. The segregation is also going to be extending into the polls, that they are not going to be able to vote. That technically, yeah, on paper they have the right to vote, but there's going to be things like poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and all those things that are going to keep them from being able to vote. That only 20% of African Americans are registered to vote and are voting at this point in history because there's a lot of things keeping them from voting. And so they really don't have political power, and they are going to be held back from where they can work in society, and that is going to be this kind of foundation as we get into the civil rights movement of this discrimination, racism, that is going to be what the whole movement's fighting against. So in the North, there is going to be a little bit more freedom than there is in the South, but there's still segregated communities. There's housing ordinances. Last lecture I talked about redlining. Redlining is going to be a thing. You're going to see mortgage discrimination, that people of African American descent aren't going to be able to get loans for houses or businesses and things like that. They're going to face police harassment. They're going to have all sorts of different things that are going to keep them from being able to rise up in their status in society. Literally every single area of life and death that you can think of is segregated. Buses, water fountains, schools, bathrooms, cemeteries, hospitals, and oftentimes that segregation pushed it so people didn't have equal and open access to the same things, and usually it wasn't the same quality of things when they had that access. I know this summer I was listening to, I don't know what I was listening to, probably a podcast, probably NPR, who knows, and they were talking about the Montgomery bus boycotts and how this one guy who was shot at one of the boycotts, he was shot, and he initially was taken to a white hospital, and he was still alive at this point, and they refused to see him because he was African American. They said, no, you have to take him an hour away from here in order to be served at the African American hospital. You know, just it is what it is. And so they refused to see him, and on the way to that other hospital, he died because It's an hour's drive, and he just got shot. So anyways, Jim Crow laws. Okay. Executive Order 80... Wow, that's a terrible grainy picture, sorry. It looked better when it was smaller. Okay, Executive Order 8802. So Philip Randolph, who's going to lead the Brotherhood of Sleeping Porters, is the largest black trade union, is going to call for a march in Washington in 1941. And he's looking for equal opportunity in wartime industries, as well as everyone that's marching with him. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to issue this executive order, and that is going to prohibit discrimination in defense industry. So different things that are helping to provide for the wartime effort, there's going to be no discrimination. That there is no like, hey, you can only have white workers here and all that. So this is going to create the Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC, and they are going to have a few enforcement powers, but they're going to set a precedent for federal action on race issues. That this is kind of laying, again, remember, all this is just laying the foundation as we really get into the civil rights movement. So then we have the Double V campaign. You learned a little bit about this in class with the stations about World War II. But this is the whole idea of victory abroad and victory at home. That, you know, we're going to go fight fascism abroad. We're going to have, you know, this idea that we are going to fight for the United States democratic principles. And they are going to encourage men and women to support the war effort, both overseas and at home. Because the hope is that, like, once you are kind of proving where you are in society and that you're committed to American ideologies, that should help fight racism and fight for equality here in the United States. So victory abroad and victory at home. So then this is going to lead to the Civil Rights and New Deal Coalition. So Harry S. Truman, who is president after Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and actually Harry S. Truman is a bit of a racist, but he is going to support civil rights on moral grounds, even though he uses some pretty racist language in his daily life. He recognizes the importance of the black vote in the North, and he appoints a presidential committee on civil rights in 1946 because he's trying to get elected, and that's going to be released in 1947. And Truman is going to desegregate the armed forces, which is a really big deal, and employment in federal agencies, which is also a really big deal. And he is, up to this point, is viewed as the most aggressive president on civil rights since Reconstruction. And obviously before, I guess it would have been Abraham Lincoln. But, you know, the Southern Democrats are going to view Harry Truman as this person who is trying to attack their institutions and their way of life and their whole ideology about how the system runs and how it works and all that, because they are that ingrained and that tuned into wanting segregation and African Americans being unequal in their society. Okay, so race and anti-communism. So Truman is going to fear racism in the United States. Is going to discredit the American image in the world. This was something that Stalin and Lenin and the Soviet Union were both very critical of. That, you know, in the United States, not everyone's treated fairly, not everyone's treated equally. And, you know, just look at the African American population in the United States and how cruelly they're treated. And, you know, that doesn't happen in communism. Everyone is equal, regardless of money, regardless of status, regardless of ethnicity, and all of those things. That it's just all equal. And so Truman's like, we got to make sure we are treating people more equally. So McCarthyism and the hunt for subversives at home is going to hold the civil rights movement back because we're worried about how that kind of is going to appear to foreign nations, aka the Soviet Union. Opponents of the civil rights movement are going to charge that racial integration is communistic, and the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is what it stands for, was banned in many southern states because they viewed it as an anti-American organization that had communist roots, even though that wasn't the case. Okay, so then we get to Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall is quite a guy. So he is from Maryland, so that's why there are different things in Maryland named after him. That's why our airport, BWI Thurgood Marshall, is named after this gentleman. But he is a big deal. I'm going to tell you why in a second. So He's denied admission to the University of Maryland Law School. So then he's going to attend Howard University in Baltimore. That's the one in Baltimore, right? Yeah, I'm fairly certain. If I'm not, go Google me, I'm sorry. I'm wrong. So he attends that in 1936. And he is going to then have Charles Hamilton Houston, who is going to challenge the University of Maryland Law School's admission policy. In 1944, Marshall is going to challenge the all-white primaries in Maryland. He becomes an attorney. He becomes a practicing lawyer. And in 1950, he argues in the Supreme Court that universities couldn't segregate Black students from others on college campuses. He is going to be fighting in different cases all across the United States, fighting for African Americans' rights and desegregation, and fighting for equality in so many different places. There is a really good book called Devils in the Orange Grove, where it talks about Thurgood Marshall fighting against a case that was very obviously a public lynching, fighting against that and fighting for justice. And this man got death threats, but he still went on living his best life and getting business done, which is just very, very impressive. But he eventually is going to become a justice on the Supreme Court, and is just very influential within history and a very fascinating man. If you want to know more about him, definitely recommend some Googling, because he is so interesting. Okay, so Brown versus Board of Education. You 100% learned about this last year in government, but just to refresh your memory, just in case you hit reset from freshman year. You're going to see Linda Brown, who is a student in Topeka, Kansas, is going to be forced to attend a segregated school that is farther from her home instead of the all-white elementary school that is nearby. You're going to see that the NAACP is going to pick up this case, and they're going to help move it up, and Thurgood Marshall is going to be the one who argues for this case in the Supreme Court, and he's going to talk about the fact that Brown is denied equal protection of the laws, that she had a right to go to that school that was right down the street from her versus the school that is several miles over, and is much farther for her to go to, and is not equal whatsoever. So May 17th, 1954, the court is going to rule that separate educational facilities are inherently equal. So there is no way to try to argue that they're going to be equal and everything's going to be fair and everyone's going to be in the same playing field, because they're not. Because the message you're sending about having separate schools is a racist message, and things are not equal in the same places. Southerners, though, are going to, I know surprisingly, they're going to resist this. They're going to put into place this thing called the Southern Manifesto, where 101 members of Congress are going to denounce the court's decision. The Ku Klux membership is going to grow after Brown versus Board of Education decision is released. And President Eisenhower is going to accept the law, but he's not going to be too intense about enforcing it in the South until we get to Little Rock, which you'll learn about more in class. So I don't want to spoil that. But in Little Rock, it's been 3 years since Brown versus Board of Education decision has been released, before this whole moment in Arkansas blows up. But pretty much, you're going to see that desegregation is going to be put in place in schools, and that is then going to trickle out into different areas of society and life. That is going to be this kind of current that's going to be helping to push the civil rights movement forward. But there's going to be a lot of Southern backlash against that to begin with. Okay, analysis questions. So you are going to look up those Reconstruction Amendments of the 13th, 14th, and 15th, unless you remember them, because you are so smart and remember them from when we learned about the Civil War and Reconstruction. And if you don't, just go Google them. It's not the end of the world. Just the basics of what they are, what they do, all that wonderful stuff. And then basically, how do we, get to, my elbow just fell off. How do we get to 1865, end of the Civil War? We make all these promises in the amendments to the American citizens, to the American people, and very largely African Americans. How do we get there, make these promises, and then how are they broken promises? How are we nearly 100 years later, we're not quite 100 years later, but we're almost there, that they're more so broken promises? What about them says we didn't follow up exactly how we thought we would? We didn't really make happen what we said we were going to do in those amendments. Okay, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to sign up for Key Time on the front board, to come in to see me before or after school, and to write your question onto your homework paper, to submit it to Edmodo, to email to me, or just to ask your question in class, because someone else might have the same exact question as you. I hope you enjoyed this beautiful lecture.